waiting for others to be before it is, and in those dark holes where light is swallowed whole or in pieces, hope stands in the gap.
For me, a big part of what I write about is hope, is to give people hope, it's to encourage them. It's to give people also a new perspective on some of the things that we take for granted. Think about something like racism, for example. We tend to look at the world in very black and white ways because of what we've inherited from our parents, our families, our societies. And so it's to actually try and give a different perspective that will say, these people are actually human as much as I am, that we're all in this together, really.
Perhaps it is time for a national craniotomy to remove cancerous mindsets that cannot seem to grasp that skin need not be unraveled in order for us to see that humanity is our birthright. Perhaps the problem is our eyes. Is it blindness or a simple lack of compassion that staples our eyelids to the tops of our cheekbones where smiles come to die so we can say, we never saw the injustice?
Performance poetry it emulates real life in a big way. It's one of those, art imitating life. Because we speak, we perform our stories on the daily. If you're telling something that happened over the weekend, that's a performance that you're constantly in. And I think that performance poetry draws from that we're telling stories, we're storytellers. So it's something that I think people relate to in ways that those who aren't big on reading won't necessarily relate to. So I think there's a big emotional element. Started writing poetry in Standard 7, grade 9 now. I had been performing at Stedfords and so on from well before that, when I was in primary school, involved in school plays and so on. But actually writing my own poetry started in grade 9. My English teacher, who was a really big influence in my interest in writing poetry, and I think English in general, Mrs. Harrison, she was the one who would give me feedback. So I would write poetry and then I'd give it to her and then she'd give me feedback. When I had to go to East London for a number of things, she'd drive us down. And when I was published in English Alive, which is the high school poetry anthology, it's a South African one, and so she would help me as well, just giving me feedback and so on. So I'd say that's where it really started. I do have one poem that tends to come back. It's a poem called Dear Sun, which I wrote in 2012, and it was inspired by the story of Anine Boyson, which I hope most people know about. And I remember that it really struck me because the fact that she'd been attacked by people that she grew up with, for me, was quite harrowing. And I thought, how do I respond to this? How do I write about this incident? Dear Sun, I'm planting words like seeds along the lifelines in your palms. I want them to bloom into sentences, books, and libraries until you have forests of knowledge growing out of your palms. So if ever you're tempted to clench your hand against the world, I want the flowers between your knuckles to remind you that manhood is not found at the end of a fist. Because we have an opportunity as poets to tell stories that need telling. And thankfully, there is a bit of license, not only poetically, but I think socially. We often get comments like, oh, they're poets. Okay, so that's what we can expect. But we actually can use that nonchalance towards what we do to our advantage, because you start saying things that you wouldn't be able to say in any other space or in any other way, and people actually accept that because it's coming from a poet. So they expect us to say controversial and sometimes scary things and disturbing things. So I think we're able to tell stories, and obviously not just for this generation, but the ones that will follow. And they are stories that need telling.